Tonight on Reporting Scotland, just days till the vote and the referendum campaign moves into its final days. We've a special debate.
Should the UK leave the EU or remain a member? Leading campaigners from both sides of the argument will be debating live with our audience here at Pacific Quay in Glasgow.
Also in the programme, rail workers are set to strike. Industrial action will go ahead tomorrow after talks break down between ScotRail and the union. And Celtic's new manager trains his new squad as the draws are made for Scotland's football teams in Europe. Good evening and welcome to a specially extended edition of Reporting Scotland, which includes our EU referendum debate. But first, today's news. And with just days to go to the vote, the sides in Scotland have stepped up their campaigning. The First Minister told nurses that leaving the EU would end up harming the health service. But UKIP's Scottish leader said NICOLA Sturgeon couldn't be trusted. This from our political editor, Brian Taylor.
NICOLA Sturgeon.
The referendum is dominant, and so, addressing the Royal College of Nursing Congress in Glasgow, the First Minister took care to make her own position plain.
I'll be voting to remain in the EU on Thursday, and I hope others will do so too.
She told the nurses British exit would damage the NHS, as economic decline would result in spending cuts, and she broadened her case.
Well, I think it's still looking very close across the UK, which is why it's really important that everybody who wants to remain part of the world's biggest single market, to protect our own freedom of travel across the EU, to protect workers' rights and to protect this notion that independent countries in the modern world come together to work together for the greater good. If that's all important to you, then it's really vital to get out and vote Remain on Thursday.
In Edinburgh, Leave supporters seek backing from the public.
Looking straight into this camera, please. It's good. Give us that wink again.
Ever obliging, UKIP's Scottish leader David Coburn follows photographic advice. He says Nicola Sturgeon can't be trusted on the NHS as her own record is poor. For him, this referendum is about choice and about the UK regaining control.
My campaign message is vote to leave the European Union. It's best in Scotland's interests. We get our 200-mile fishing limit back. We get to decide who runs our country, not run by an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels, but by our own parliament in Hollywood, and in Westminster. So make sure that we make our own decisions and we can throw people out once every 5 years.
Our democratically elected colleague Joe Cox.
In the Commons this afternoon, tributes to the late Joe Cox MP, who was shot dead. MPs united today, each wearing the white rose of her native Yorkshire. But they and voters will divide once more for the referendum this Thursday.
Rail passengers across Scotland are facing the first in a series of strikes tomorrow after talks at the conciliation service ACAS broke down. The RMT union says ScotRail wants to water down and wipe out the safety role of the guard on long-distance journeys, endangering passenger safety. ScotRail says this is nonsense and the majority of services already operate this way. Here's our correspondent, Andrew Kerr.
Raising a flag about rail safety, the RMT protested outside ScotRail's HQ this morning. At the moment, on long-distance diesel trains, there's a driver and a guard. The guard operates the doors. On the electrified suburban routes, where 59% of journeys take place, there's a driver and ticket examiner, but the driver operates the doors. The union says ScotRail ultimately wants to reduce the safety role of the guard in some long-distance routes, replacing a skilled job with ticket examiners.
When trains have to be evacuated, a ticket collector is not trained to evacuate the train. That's the difference between their role and a guard's role. And of course, people like to see guards on trains for all sorts of reasons, but it's the safety critical role, the evacuations, the protection of the travelling public. That's the main thing that we want to maintain.
ScotRail have expressed their frustration, saying safety and jobs are not at risk. They're calling for the RMT to get back round the table with no preconditions in a row that appears to be over who opens and closes doors.
For 30 years, we have operated a safe system of work, which the RMT says is not safe. For 30 years, we've operated that in Scotland. 59% of our customers today travel with that safe system of operation. So it is so disingenuous, so avoidable and so unnecessary.
Final efforts to resolve the strike failed at the conciliation service ACAS in Glasgow at lunchtime. The prospect of a strike can be annoying for travellers in any part of the country, but for commuters in the Central Belt, perhaps it's particularly frustrating as they're facing long journeys already because of the Queen Street improvement works.
I'm travelling through from Falkirk and it's taking 50 minutes to come through and it's putting me right off.
I used to commute and it was an absolute nightmare if the trains were cancelled or even delayed, so yeah. Not good. Just wondering.
It's not going to affect me at all, I'm sorry. So I'm going down to Yorkshire, so it wouldn't affect me.
Well, it's always frustrating. You know, you plan your day ahead and you hope that that's going to be what you plan is what's going to happen. So you just take the best as you can.
So the first strike is tomorrow, generally affecting longer distance diesel trains. Another 6 days of action are planned, with passengers being urged to check their journeys online before travelling. Andrew Kerr, reporting Scotland, Glasgow.
There's been a further fall in crimes reported to police in Scotland. They fell by just over 3% in the year to the end of last March. There were fewer murders, but overall violent crime was up by 5.6%, with serious assaults up by under a quarter. Sexual crimes also increased, although police say many of those offences were historical and there were fewer rapes. To sport now, and Celtic's summer break is already over. The new manager Brendan Rodgers and his squad had their first day's training today, and there was an immediate focus on the European Champions League as the qualifying draw was made this morning. Rona McLeod can tell us more.
Monday afternoon in Lennoxtown, and Brendan Rodgers gets his first chance to look at the Celtic players, and he must hit the ground running. Success vital in the Champions League campaign, which begins in just over 3 weeks.
You know, he's a very experienced individual. He's, worked at top clubs. He's an understanding. He knows what this club's about. He grew up supporting the club. He's followed the club for a long time, so he understands the pressure that comes with the job. The demands to, perform and win.
Celtic will face a trip to either Estonian side Flora Tallinn or Lincoln of Gibraltar in the Champions League's second qualifying round. The first leg will be away on the 12th or 13th of July, with the return the following week. The more likely opponents to emerge from the first qualifying round tie will be Flora Tallinn. The club, established in 1990, has never been relegated from the Estonian top division. But also battling to meet Celtic are the Lincoln Red Imps, a semi-professional football club from Gibraltar.
As we always do, we'll approach the game with all the preparation done. We'll make sure we do our homework. We have to make sure we're up to speed. We're fit, we're strong, and the team's fully prepared going into the game because we want to obviously be in the Champions League, so we can take no chances.
Celtic have lost in the final playoff round for the past 2 seasons. The immediate pressure, spoken or not, is for Rodgers to reach the Champions League group stage. Rona McLeod, reporting Scotland.
And Scotland has 3 other teams in European action next season. The draw for the qualifying rounds of the Europa League have also been made in 10 days' time. Aberdeen will be at home to Fola Eschk from Luxembourg, while in Edinburgh, Hearts play Infonet of Estonia. Hibs will meet Valo Reykjavik or the Danish side Brøndby, and that's in the second qualifying round in mid-July. And we stay with matters European. I'll be back later with the weather forecast, but now it's time to cross to my colleague Glenn Campbell for a special EU referendum debate. Glenn.
Thanks very much, Jackie. And debating live before our audience here in Glasgow this evening, leading in and out campaigners. For Leave, the former Conservative Scottish Secretary, Lord Forsyth. For Remain, the SNP's Justice and Home Affairs spokesperson at Westminster, Joanna Cherry. For Leave, the former SNP Deputy Leader, Jim Sillars. And for Remain, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Kezia Dugdale. So our panellists will be taking questions from the audience, which includes committed Leave and Remain supporters in equal numbers and some undecided voters as well. Let's go straight to our first question, which comes from Fraser Knox.
Good evening, panel. How large of a shock to the UK economy would a Brexit be?
It's a hotly debated question. Let me put that first of all to KEZIA Dugdale.
I think it would be a very significant shock. I think it would be very serious, and we probably see the results of it almost instantly as the markets open on Friday. Now, I'm not here to scare you into that prospect. I want to make a positive case for why I think we're better off being part of the European Union. I think it's good to create jobs, to sustain the economy that we have, to create opportunities for young people, and there's no question that it's been good for workers' rights. We can now make sure we don't compete with our nearest neighbours on things like holiday leave and the amount of money that we earn in a day, and maternity and paternity rights. That's all come because we're part of the European Union, and I hope it continues in that vein.
Lord Forsyth.
I don't like the word shock. There might be some short-term uncertainty. Broadly, I'm with Lord Rose, who's the leader of the Remain campaign, in the view that it wouldn't really make very much difference and matters would settle down after a period of time. And despite all the scaremongering that's been going on, if you look at the markets today, the pound is broadly where it was before the referendum was announced. And the markets, actually the stock market went up this morning. So I don't think that's the way to look at it anyway. What we're talking about here is whether or not we restore to our parliamentary democracy the ability to take decisions. And I believe in Britain, and I believe that given the opportunity to decide our own destiny, we will prosper in the long term, and that's how we should look at it.
The UK Chancellor, George Osborne, has produced Treasury analysis which he says would cost 43,000 Scottish jobs within 2 years of a Brexit. He's talked about having to have an emergency budget to plug £30 billion of a black hole in UK finances. Do you buy those figures, Joanna Cherry?
Well, I think people in Scotland are a little bit sick of this sort of campaigning, constantly scaremongering and raising fears. But what is undoubtedly true is that membership of the European Union has brought very significant benefits to the British and the Scottish economy. For example, inward investment. Of all the regions and nations in the United Kingdom, Scotland receives the most by way of inward investment from the European Union, to the tune of 16 billion per annum. In terms of our exports from Scotland, our exports to the EU are worth 2,000 per head of everybody in this country, and they support over 300,000 jobs.
OK, but
if
when
we
the
voluntarily withdraw from that market,
Chancellor
we won't
says,
have
this is important
access.
because he's on the same side of the debate as you on this occasion, and when he says that 43,000 Scottish jobs would go within 2 years, are you saying he's scaremongering, or do you think that those figures may be accurate?
Well, what I'm saying is, at the moment, we are part of a free market where we have access to 500 other million consumers, and this has brought massive benefits to the British and the Scottish economy. If we voluntarily withdraw from that free market, we will no longer have access to trading with that free market, and of course it's going to have an impact on jobs and investment.
We'll lose 43,000 within 2 years?
I'm not prepared to put a figure on it. I'm not able to put a figure on it. But what I'm saying is it is a no-brainer that if we withdraw from the free market, it will affect jobs and investments across the United Kingdom.
Jim Sillas.
There will be an agreement reached between the European Union and a United Kingdom out of the EU. And I'll tell you why. It's there in the trade figures. The European 27 export to us round about £290 billion worth of goods and services a year. We export to them round about £228 billion a year. So it is in the interests of both sides, because the way Joanna put it, you'd think trade was only one way. It's a two-way trade. There are jobs tied up in the UK with access to that market, and there's lots of jobs tied up in the European Union about access to our markets. Plus the fact, if we vote Brexit on Thursday, we do not leave the European Union on Friday. First of all, the United Kingdom government has to write a formal letter to the Commission saying we wish to withdraw under Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. There then has to be negotiations over a 2-year period when we are still members of the European Union in that market.
Okay.
And if you think of those figures and the millions of jobs on both sides, common sense will in fact prevail.
Okay.
There will be a free trade agreement. All common sense tells you that will be the case. and the shock will not in fact occur.
OK, I want to come back to the panel in a moment, but I want to bring in some members of our audience first of all, and perhaps we'll go back to the questioner on this first of all. Mr. Knox, what do you think?
I think we need to vote leave and take back control. I think the EU sort of proved itself to be a broken down institution at its very core. So I think it's best that we leave on our own terms and we negotiate those terms with the EU rather than having to face a disorderly Brexit from the European Union at a later stage.
And do you think that there will be an economic shock and that is something that we just have to absorb, or do you think that there is scaremongering going on?
I think there will be a short-term period of market volatility and turbulence, and then once the markets get their idea around the fact that we're going to be leaving the European Union, then the markets will quickly recover. OK, there's a gentleman on the other side of the room, yes.
Yeah, Mr. Silla said there will be an agreement if we do leave the European Union. How can you be so certain? What happens if other countries rebel against us because we have left?
Which other countries are going to rebel?
I couldn't say what other countries, but there could be other countries that rebel against us because we have left. And you can't be 100% sure that they will let us have an agreement with them. You cannot be sure. It's
No, I'm not saying you'd be 100% sure.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that if you look at the facts on the ground of trade and the jobs involved in Euro coming to us and our jobs going to them, common sense will prevail. It would be a lunacy on their part to put trade barriers up against us, because we would put trade barriers up against them, and that serves nobody's purpose. I'm assuming that all the hysteria from Merkel and company will in fact die down. For example, there is no way the German trade unions, whose members are reliant on selling to our market, are going to allow a European politician to act in a stupid way in reference to a free trade agreement between us and the EU. Now, I can't guarantee 100% that the politicians will come to their senses, but the facts on the ground indicate clearly that they will.
Joanna Cherry.
Thanks, Glenn. Well, Jim's right in the sense that there probably would be some sort of agreement in due course. But of course, what matters about the agreement is the terms of the agreement. And don't just take my word for it. Look what the Norwegian Prime Minister told us last week. She said if the British leave the European Union, they won't like it. Because in order to have free trade with the European Union, Norway has to agree to passportless border checks in the Schengen area, and it also has to agree to the free movement of people. But it has no say in how those regulations are reached. And the Norwegian Prime Minister herself described her government as being like a lobbying organisation in Brussels.
That's not true, by the way.
It's true, Jim, and you can read it in the newspapers. Any of you can go home and Google it and see that it's accurate. That's exactly what she said last week. She described it as such, so take her word for it. Now, the difficulty is that we don't know what the terms of the agreement would be. Those who want to leave the European Union often cite migration and the free movement of workers as one of the main reasons they want to leave. If you want to be part of a free trade agreement from out with the EU, then you will have to agree to free movement of workers, as Norway has had to do and as Switzerland has had to do.
Lord Forsyth is shaking his head at that.
Well, I mean, there are examples of countries who have a free trade with the EU that don't have free movement of workers.
Which countries?
Turkey is an example, or Liechtenstein is an example. But we're not Liechtenstein and we're not Norway. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. And as Jim has pointed out, they sell £62 billion worth more of product to us. And anybody who thinks with the German and the French elections coming up that if we vote to leave on Friday, Angela Merkel's office is not going to be filled with BMW and VW and other manufacturers saying, for goodness sake, we sell 1 million cars to Britain every year. Please make sure that this free trade existing agreement is maintained. This is simple scaremongering. And you don't need to be in the EU in order to sell goods and services to Europe. America does that. And actually those countries which are not in the EU have been far better at increasing their exports than we have as members of the EU.
I want to hear from another couple of voices from our audience, and I'll come back to Kez on the panel. Yeah, gentleman here.
Yes, our economy is the 5th largest in the world, but that relies heavily on trade.
particularly with the EU.
Here.
And the IMF has come out and said the value of the pound could fall as much as 10% in the event of a Brexit. How's that going to impact on trade?
Well, actually, if the pound were to fall in value, that will help our exporters enormously. What people don't... well, you say, no, it will make imports more expensive, which means that it will be easier for our own organisations, our own businesses to thrive and prosper. The point about the single market is the use of the word market is misleading. It is a single regulatory zone. And anyone can sell into the single market. The Chinese or the Indians and others do so.
Yes, but they have to do it according to
All right,
terms.
I actually want to hear...
Tariffs will be applied.
I want to hear from the audience just for a moment, and I will come back to the panel here. The lady on this side here, yeah.
Yeah, I'm still undecided, but this is the nub of where my dilemma lies. Do the Remain campaigners think that economic certainty is worth sacrificing our sovereignty for?
KEZIA DUGDALE.
I actually think that we benefit from sharing a bit of our sovereignty with other nations, to have that strong economy, to have workers' rights, to have the opportunities that our young people get from being part of Europe. But when we're talking about these economic questions, you're hearing 4 politicians argue about it. Look at what some of the business leaders are saying. Look at what the Scottish whisky industry are saying. They're saying...
my concern is...
Hang on a second, we don't have a microphone.
Of course, but my point to you would be, you know, the economy is based on the people who generate the wealth, and the Scottish Whisky Association are saying to us and to you that it's hugely important to them that Scotland as be part of the United Kingdom, is part of the European Union, because it means that they can trade with 28 nations with one set of regulations around marketing and health and safety and bottle size and all the rest of it. But it's also an amazing platform for Scottish whisky to get to China and to get to America. That platform of being part of Europe is hugely advantageous to trade beyond Europe as well as within Europe itself. So I'm inclined to listen to business. You're saying it's good for the economy. Yes, we have to cede a bit of sovereignty, and Jim will explain why he thinks that's a bad idea. But I don't think we should be afraid of that if it means that we're stronger overall, that we're better off overall.
Let me bring in a follow-up question, still economy related. It comes from Adam McIntyre Martins. Adam.
Will Vote Leave finance the fishery and agriculture sectors to the same level as the EU after a Brexit?
Jim Sillars.
I would imagine so. There's no reason why not. Before we entered the European Union, in my time as a Member of Parliament, we had what were called deficiency payments to our farmers. The money will be there to do so, and I would doubt very much indeed if any government of any particular ideology would starve our agricultural sector. And by the way, on fishing, the final thing from the SNP point of view since 1973 would be that we would get rid of the common fisheries policy. Now, whether it was conducted from Westminster or Holyrood, as one professor at Glasgow University says, that will redound to the benefit of Scottish fisheries.
Just on farming, why do you think the NFU in Scotland has come out against a British exit? Scott Walker, its chief executive, arguing that overall benefits of staying in outweigh advantages that farm businesses would gain from leaving the EU.
Well, I don't know why he said that, because I've talked to lots of farmers who are voting for leave, who would prefer the deficiency payment system that we operated previously. You get people like the NFU come up and say on the balance, but actually there's no figures ever provided by them that would clinch the argument in that way. And by the way, the common fisheries policy undoes the argument that KEZIA was making, that you share sovereignty in the EU. You do not share sovereignty in the EU. You transfer sovereignty to the central institutions of the EU. And the common fisheries policy is a classic example of that transfer.
OK, farming and fishing. Joanna Cherry.
The common agricultural policy has brought very significant benefits to Scotland. Vital funding to farmers and landowners to subsidise farming and forestry in difficult and vulnerable areas. It also provides very significant funding to all sorts of activities in the rural area, all sorts of community and environmental activities. And why the National Farmers Union of Scotland have said that they don't want to come out of the EU is absolutely clear, because they gave evidence to a Holyrood committee about this recently. They said 40% of the European Union budget is spent on the common agricultural policy. significant subsidies come to Scotland, and they said nobody has told us what is going to replace those subsidies. So that's why the National Farmers
George
Union are
Eustace,
against it.
who is the Minister of State for Farming in the UK government and is campaigning on the Leave side, says that farmers, in his view, would get as much support or perhaps even more as they get now.
Well, that's his view. He's not giving us any detail. He's not saying us what policy is going to replace. You know, he can say whatever he likes as his view, but he has to give us a bit more detail. And this is one of the main problems with the Leave campaign. Last year, 2 years ago in the Scottish independence referendum, when the Scottish Government was asking people to vote for independence, they produced a big white paper with detailed proposals. The Leave campaign have produced absolutely nothing of the sort.
Well, Lord Forsyth is a director of Vote Leave, the official Leave campaign.
Look, it's nothing to do with George Eustace. The moment that we vote to leave on Friday, farming and fishing policy will be the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament.
Well, actually,
it is a huge...
I'd like to come back on that, Glenn, because it's an important proviso there.
It is a huge transfer of power to Scotland, so the Scottish Parliament can decide what happens to our fishermen and what happens to our farmers, and I venture to suggest they'll be better off. Got a £10 note here. Who's going to give me £20 for it? Because that's the deal in Europe. We pay them 20 billion, we get 10 back. And we're told how to spend it. And you talk to any farmer in Scotland today and ask them how it's been this year, filling in the forms and the disaster of paying the money. We send the money to Europe, who then produce very complicated systems of grant, and it then gets sent back to us in ways that they determine. I want the Scottish Parliament to be able to decide these matters and to have a fishing policy and an agricultural policy which is right for Scotland.
Well, I'm going to let Joanna Cherry pick up on that in a moment, but I want to just pick up with you this business of how much money would come to the farmers, because the Vote Leave battle bus suggests that the money that we might save if we left the European Union in contributions would be more likely directed to the NHS.
Well, it isn't actually. You
can't spend it twice.
Listen, this is not a general election. We are not electing a government here. And it's not about winning or losing. It's about informing the public on the issues. And at the end of the day, we will get money back. We will get 10 billion back. How it is spent is a matter for the elected governments, in Westminster for the Westminster government, and in Scotland with agriculture and fishing and education and other powers which will come back to Scotland, it will be a matter for the First Minister and the Scottish Parliament to decide.
Briefly on that point, and then I want to hear from the audience.
Just to finish the point, and that is how it should be. At the moment, 60% of our laws and regulations are made by unelected commissioners to whom are accountable to no one and whom you cannot get rid of.
OK, Joanna Cherry on
Briefly on that point,
powers.
Fisheries and farming have been devolved since 1998, but negotiating with other countries over common fisheries policies and common agricultural policies are not devolved. Those are the preserve of Westminster. Furthermore...
We've got a Scottish government now.
But have you read the Scotland Act, Lord Forsyth?
Yes, I have, yes.
Well, it's very clear that negotiating with international governments is a reserved matter, and I don't think you'll be able to contradict me on that.
But we wouldn't be negotiating with international governments because we would have returned power to Britain. We'd no longer be...
Jim has just talked about making trade agreements with other countries. We have to replace what we have with something else. But here's the other thing, just very briefly, Glenn.
Very briefly, please.
Lord Forsyth has said that Scottish Government will have more power. The economic levers of power remain at Westminster. If the British government is going to have more money as a result of withdrawing from Europe...
And you accept it would?
What if it's going to have more money as a result of withdrawing from Europe? I said if. Who's to say that it will give any of that money to the Scottish Government to replace the subsidies that we currently get for our fishermen and for our farmers?
OK, I want to bring in some voices from the audience. In fact, I think we've got... I think we have a farmer in our audience. Is Andrew Wilson here? Andrew, yeah, let's come to you first of all.
I have a question for both sides here.
Well, maybe just make it as a point, just to contribute to the debate.
Well, it's a well-known fact that farmers have been in turmoil for near on 2 years. There has been various campaigns to the government, and there has yet to be any support from a UK government base. So what makes you think that if we exit Europe, they would support farmers because they have an opportunity to do so just now? This is the hour, but there is nothing to see.
As I understand it, you've yet to make up your mind and decide which way to vote on Thursday. How big a concern is this for you in reaching that decision?
Oh, well, it's colossal, really. So it is, because it's not just farmers; it's the whole rural economy that benefit from it.
What is it you want? What is it you want the government to do?
Well, what I'm saying is that we're still waiting on subsidy payments that were due last year. If they can't deliver that, how on earth are they going to deliver a whole common agricultural policy within the UK?
Well, they're not delivering a common agricultural policy from Europe, are they? You've just explained that.
Exactly. Yeah, but if they can't deliver that, how on earth are they going to deliver? Our understanding is that it's sitting at the door of the UK government, so how can they deliver their own policy?
OK. Let me bring in a voice from this side of the room. Gentleman with the glasses on the end there.
Must confess, this is the second time I've heard Michael Forsyth bring up this phrase, unelected bureaucrats. Does the term pot, kettle and black spring to mind?
OK, and there were some hands up on this side of the room. The lady...
Well, actually, the great virtue, the great virtue of our system, on your point, which is a dig at me because I'm a member of the House of Lords, which is accountable to the House of Commons, the great virtue of our system is you were able to kick me out in '97 when you didn't agree with my policies. Right. That is what is at stake here.
All right. OK, I actually want to hear more from the audience and I'll come back to the panel. Can I have the lady just here, please?
You say about the common agricultural policy, but it actually doesn't work for Scotland at all, to the point that it could actually impact the barley production for the whisky trade that KEZIA actually talked up so well.
Well, that's not what the National Farmers Union say, madam.
Sorry,
you know, they want to
can we bring in KEZIA Dugdale at this point, please?
It's what your committee said.
OK,
Holyrood.
let's hear from KEZIA Dugdale.
There was something else that Michael Forsyth said that we can't let go by, Glenn, and that's that sense that 60% of our laws come from Europe. I'm afraid that's just not true. In fact, only 13% of our laws even reference the European Union, let alone enforce laws made in Europe upon us. So it's another one of these scaremongering stories that you accused us of right at the start of the programme. But listen, the concerns about farming are very real indeed. Likewise in the fishing industry, and you know, I've got family in Fraserburgh and Peterhead where this is real. This is about people's livelihoods and it's very serious indeed. You ask the Scottish Fishermen's Federation what they think about Europe. They say they're neutral because they say that the fisheries policy doesn't work for them, but they don't want to lose out on that aspect of free trade across Europe. And they don't know what's in their best interests. So that is really, really difficult. Maybe there aren't easy answers here. So what I would say to you is think about this. Do you really genuinely believe that a Tory government wants to give more subsidy, more public money to you as a farmer? Do you really believe that they want to give more money to our NHS? The Tories believe in smaller state intervention and smaller government. Okay. They're not out to help you get from one week to the next or one season to the next. They believe in smaller government. That's what they exist to do.
And no doubt we'll hear more from Lord Forsyth as the debate develops. I want to move to another question, though, and this one comes from Sarah Long. Sarah.
So I was wondering, how would remaining in the EU or leaving affect or controlling the high levels of immigration we're experiencing across the UK at the moment?
Michael Forsyth.
Well, I agree with Jeremy Corbyn, who said on the MAR programme on Sunday that while we are in the European Union, it will be impossible for us to control the levels of immigration. And I think that that's very important. I think we do need to have migrants coming to our country, but we need to be able to control the numbers so that we're able to match the services for the schools, for the health service, for housing, for congestion on our roads and all the other things that we have to live with in our country. There are many countries which are not in the European Union. In fact, most countries in the world are not in the European Union, but almost all countries that I can think of think it's important to be able to control their borders, who comes in here, and also who we can throw out. The fact that because of the European Court we find ourselves with serious criminals here whom we cannot expel, that is a good example of how we have lost control of our ability to run our own affairs, and by leaving the European Union we can have an immigration policy which meets our needs, which brings the skills that we need to Scotland and to the United Kingdom as a whole, and also an immigration policy which is fair to those people who want to come here from non-EU countries, people from India, from Pakistan, from South Africa, from Australia, and so on, so that we welcome people who can make a real contribution to our economy and not turn people aside who could make a huge contribution to the health service and other services because we are stuck with our inability to control numbers coming from the European Union.
And in terms of net migration, of EU citizens to the United Kingdom, according to the Office for National Statistics. In the year that ended June 2015, around 180,000 came to the UK, obviously a smaller proportion to Scotland. And yesterday, this interview that Lord Forsyth referred to on the MAR programme with your UK party leader, KEZIA Dugdale, Jeremy Corbyn, was asked, is there any kind of upper limit to immigration coming into this country? And he said, I don't think you can have one while you have a free movement of labour. Do you agree with that?
Well, can I first of all say that I think we should recognise that people choosing to live and make their lives in Scotland is a positively good thing. It's added a tremendous amount to our society to be culturally diverse, to have those mix of ethnicities, and we should recognise that. Those figures that you highlighted, Glenn, are right. 180,000 people. It's a very small percentage of our overall population. If you listen to the Leave campaign, I'm afraid we've all seen that horrific poster that Nigel Farage unveiled this week. You would think that every migrant came to this country, they got a house, they were on benefits, that they took everything from us. They're being blamed, they're being told that they're the fault of everything that's wrong in our society. Hang on a wee second, Glenn, just let me get one statistic out, it's very important.
You can weave it in, but the question I asked you was about what Jeremy Corbyn said on the programme yesterday. Do you agree that there can be no limit?
Well, he's clear to say that that's an aspect of our current situation within the EU.
That's a fact.
Yes, I think that's right. But we also have to recognise that immigration into the United Kingdom is much broader than just people that come from the European Union. It's much more complex than that. And there's no solution to immigration, however you feel about it, on the ballot paper on Thursday. The questions that we are being asked are about what type of country do we want to be? What type of society do we want to be? Do we want to be one which is represented by Nigel Farage that tries to label immigrants as forever taking from us? Just 5% of EU immigrants claim benefits in our country, Glenn. If you listen to the Leave campaign, you'd think it was 95%. You are more likely to be treated by an immigrant in the NHS than you are to be sat next to somebody. Our NHS would fall apart if it wasn't for the contribution of EU migrants. Now, if you think that there's a problem in our country with access to a GP, not enough council houses for young people, problems with our school placements, blame the Tories who've spent the last 5 years cutting public services. Don't blame immigrants that all they've done is invest in it.
I want to bring in our two middle panellists in a moment, but seeing as KEZIA Dugdale mentioned the Tories, I'll let you come back in briefly, Michael Forsyth. But just to start with, that poster that KEZIA Dugdale referred to, with the column of people seeking refuge in the European Union, with the banner on it, breaking point, what did you think when you saw that?
I thought it was a particularly stupid poster because it confused two things, which is refugees and economic migrants. And I'd like to see us being able to do more on refugees, and that means being able to control the numbers coming into our country, which we need to do if we leave the European Union. I mean, for example, there is the most appalling persecution going on in Syria and elsewhere of Christians. And I've been trying to persuade the government to declare this as genocide, which would mean that we could intervene directly to help those people. So I thought it was a silly poster, but quite frankly, if this campaign is reduced to arguing about posters that Nigel Farage has got, when what is at stake here is our democratic future, then I think something has gone badly wrong with the campaign.
Let me bring in the audience and then we'll come back to our other panellists. In the back row, lady in the middle, yes.
Yes, there's a lot being said about immigration from people coming into the country, but immigration actually works both ways. There are 2.2 million Brits who are working, living and retired abroad. And I'd like to know what's going to happen to them. If we come out of the EU, do they all have to come back? You know, what kind of future is there for all these people?
OK, pick up on that in your answer to the broader question, Jim Sillas.
I think it'll be like Norway. There's about 40,000 Norwegians actually live in Spain, I think. I don't think they'll be greatly affected one way or the other, to tell you the truth. On immigration, now let me make it perfectly plain, that on the Leave side, people have different reasons for wanting to leave. We are not all Nigel Farages, let me tell you. And I think if the Leave side loses on Thursday, he will be primarily responsible for the disgraceful way he has conducted the argument on immigration. We need a rational, sensible, adult discussion. Not so much a debate, but a discussion about immigration. Of course, numbers of people coming into a country create a problem. The problem isn't cultural or stealing someone's job, it's being able to plan. When I was on a hospital board many years ago, we needed the Registrar General's figures in order that we could allocate to different areas of the medical services. At one time, we had children being born at a fair rate, so obviously we got those figures. We could give more money to the maternity services in Glasgow, which combined with the birth rate also was a problem because home births really were quite dangerous. Okay. That was before the slum clearance took place. So we've got to be able to say there are three categories of migrant. There is the asylum seeker, whom we should welcome all the time without dispute. Yeah. The other two categories are short-term economic migrants, which I have been one incidentally. When I couldn't get work in Scotland, I went to Saudi Arabia. So they are economic short-term migrants.
And the third group?
They can be, no, sorry, this is quite important because we've had an awful lot of stuff about people like me being
we're also
labelled
pressed
with
for time.
Nigel
I've got to
Farage.
get everybody in.
The other section are people who want to come and live here. And Scotland could do with many more people from all over the world coming to live here because our population was declining until we got the immigration principally from Eastern Europe, and it's now rising. Okay. A rising population is good for us all, more prosperous, and you have a bigger home market. Let's have an adult, sensible discussion.
OK, 3.3%. 3.3% of those in Scotland at the moment are EU nationals. A further 2.1% are from outside the EU. That's the proportion of the overall population. Joanna Cherry.
Well, there's absolutely no reason why free movement within the European Union should prevent us from doing our fair share to take in refugees that are fleeing from wars and trouble areas in the Middle East. And there's absolutely no reason why free movement of people within the European Union should prevent us from having a sensible immigration policy in relation to people from out with the European Union. We have a skills gap in Scotland. It needs to be filled. We need more immigrants. We've got the nonsense of the Brain family who are wanting to help and be part of the Scottish economy being sent home at the moment from Australia. But as Glenn said, only 3% of the Scottish population currently comes from the European Union. Only 5% of the population across the United Kingdom comes from the European Union. And various studies over the last couple of years have shown that migrants from the European Union make a net contribution to the British economy. That is, they are paying more by way of taxes than they are taking out by way of benefits. So I think we need to challenge the myth that's what's creating pressure on our public services in the United Kingdom is migrants from the EU.
Okay.
It's not. What's creating pressure on our public services in the United Kingdom is the failure of this Conservative government to invest properly in public services, particularly the National Health Service.
You're
and
in charge of the health service
affordable
in
housing.
Scotland.
We are not in charge.
OK, I'm going to hear...
No, Glenn, I need to come back on this. I need to come back on this. We are not in charge of the amount of money that we get to spend on the NHS. As you said yourself earlier, it is dependent on the Barnett formula. Do not blame the Scottish Government for the economic failures of the Tory government. Why should people in Scotland have to pay more than people in England to have basic, decent public services? Is that your party's policy?
All right, this is entertaining, but we're almost at the end of our time.
Maybe that's why you're not doing so well in Scotland, if that's your party's policy.
Let me hear from the lady on this side and then the gentleman here.
Just to pick up the Brain family thing, I was appalled the other day when Michael Gove suggested that if we left the EU, Scotland would be able to sort out its own immigration issues. Talking about families like the Brains from outside the EU.
Appalled why?
Why should we believe that?
Because it's disingenuous.
Yes, on the basis of what we've experienced post-referendum, promises are made. I wouldn't believe a word they say.
OK, thanks for that. And the gentleman here, very briefly.
Joanna, I agree with you. There is a skills gap in Scotland, but with the EU, we have no control over what kind of skilled workforce comes in. Surely it makes more sense to have a system where we can prioritise the kind of skills gap you keep mentioning.
Well, we can have both.
All right.
How can we have both in the EU? KEZIA and Jeremy Corbyn have just pointed out we can't control
have a
within the
sensible
EU.
migration policy, sir. That's what we don't have.
We could talk all night about this topic, but we need to move on to another one. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions on that. Our next question comes from Jamie McEwen. Jamie.
Would it be better to be an independent Scotland out with of the EU or part of the UK within the EU?
OK, an independent Scotland within the EU?
With, I think it's...
OK. Of course, other options are available, depends what happens in the referendum on Thursday. But if there is a Brexit and Scotland votes to stay in, what happens, Kezia Dugdale?
Well, can I start by saying that I don't think we should have to pick between two unions. I want to remain part of the United Kingdom and I want to remain within the European Union. It's important that I say that at the offset. If we are in a situation on Friday morning where we have voted as a United Kingdom to leave the European Union, then I actually think the arguments for staying part of the UK become even stronger. So we will have just set ourselves a task of leaving our second biggest trading partner, where so much that we've discussed tonight is already linked to. Why on earth would we then want to leave our first biggest trading partner, our nearest neighbours in England, Wales and Northern Ireland? So the Labour Party's position is simply that we oppose a second referendum on independence over the lifetime of the next 5 years. Simply because we respect democracy. We were all told that was a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generation opportunity. It has to be respected, Glenn.
Yeah, you know what, I'm obliged to remind you that in an interview in February, you contemplated that in these circumstances it wasn't inconceivable that you might back an independent Scotland.
Yeah, and I think everybody would expect me to be thoughtful and reflective about that.
You've changed your mind?
I thought that we were in a position in Scotland where we could have a more nuanced conversation about the Constitution. Turns out in Scotland we still are divided as a country between yes and no, very clearly black and white. And having thought about it, I believe very strongly, just as I did throughout the length of the independence referendum, that Scotland's future best lies within the United Kingdom. And I think especially if we were to leave the European Union, and I sincerely hope that we don't, that relationship becomes even more important. I'll be even more drawn to campaigning to remain within that United Kingdom if we leave the European Union.
Joanna Cherry.
Thanks, Glenn. Well, Kezia and I are on the same side tonight, which is very pleasant, but we were on different sides during the independence referendum. And those of you who took any interest in the independence referendum will recall that we were repeatedly told by Better Together that the only way to guarantee Scotland's continued membership of the European Union was to vote no and stay in the United Kingdom. Now, in the event that this Thursday the United Kingdom votes to leave the European Union and Scotland votes to remain in the European Union, then the circumstances in which people voted to remain in the UK in 2014 will have changed materially and significantly. And in our manifesto for the Holyrood election, the SNP said that we felt that the Scottish Parliament should be entitled to hold another referendum if there was a material and significant change in the circumstances that pertained in 2014.
OK, do you think that's what's happened? Alex Salmond says it would happen within 2 years. What do you think?
I think that there will be a groundswell of support for the idea of a second independence referendum if Scotland is taken out of the European Union against her will. And I base that on what people are saying to me on the doorsteps discussing the issue. People are concerned that they were told in 2014 that the only way to remain in the European Union was to vote no, and now they face being taken out of the European Union against their will. Now, I want to see Scotland as an independent member state in the European Union, but for so long as Scotland remains in the United Kingdom, I want to see the United Kingdom remain in the European Union. I think that is in the interest of the whole of the UK economy. That's why the SNP has been trying to run a positive campaign for the whole of the UK to remain in the European Union.
OK, Jim Sillas.
That's pure kidology, let me tell you. And I'll tell you why. I've read the manifesto, and I've also read these words in the Sunday Herald, and this is from NICOLA. I am clear that if Scotland does face being taken out of Europe against our will, then the options set out in our manifesto must be on the table for consideration. It's a very slippery word, consideration, by the way. The SNP does not have a mandate to hold a second independence referendum. They're in the same position in 2016 as Alex Salmond was in 2007, a minority government. With this difference, ALEC at least asked for a mandate. In 2016, NICOLA had the opportunity to add words there, saying, in the event of Brexit turning out this way, I ask you for a mandate in order to hold a second referendum. She doesn't have the mandate. And the power to legal power to grant a referendum is at Westminster. And the only way you can lever that out of Westminster is having a majority combined with a mandate. You then have the moral authority to say our people want it. The next time that the SNP might get a majority and might ask for a mandate is 2021.
OK, so it isn't going to happen, according to Jim Sillars.
For them to pretend to the yes voters that if Brexit turns out the way Joanna described, we're on our way to a second referendum.
Kidology,
She's making
briefly.
a promise which she cannot fulfil.
Kidology, Joanna Cherry, briefly, please.
It's not kidology. I have the greatest respect for Jim, but he is simply wrong on this issue. When you go home tonight, put your computer on, Google the SNP manifesto and look at page 24, and you'll see the words that I've set out for you. Also, we may not have a majority government, but the SNP received 46.5% of the vote. That is the highest mandate that any government has in Western Europe at present.
All right, that was a little extra opportunity to respond. No, stop.
Jim's had a nice long time.
Stop.
Let me just finish my point.
You've already had a say on this one. I want to bring in Lord Forsyth.
You don't have one.
I'm really confused about the SNP's position, because if the argument is, and it looks like the polls suggest, that if England votes to leave, but Scotland votes to remain, then we should have another referendum. Then the simple message to anyone who wants to keep the Union is that you should vote to leave in Scotland, otherwise it will be used as ammunition to make the case for another referendum. And all the polls show that the majority of people in Scotland do not want to have another referendum. And by the way, if on Friday people vote to remain in the European Union, which I'm opposed to, I will accept the result, because I'm a Democrat. And I think it's a disgrace that the SNP continue to damage Scotland's interests by continuing to drag out this idea that we could leave the United Kingdom. And if we were to leave the United Kingdom, with the oil price where it is, we'd be bust. And by the way, the EU wouldn't have you because you wouldn't be able to meet the debt criteria.
I just want to come back on this. I just want to knock this nonsense on the head that would be bust. Figures show that if Scotland was an independent country at present, she would have a deficit of about 7 or 8 billion. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Kingdom has a deficit of 76 billion, despite 6 years of austerity.
We've had this argument, you lost it.
Well, you brought it up, Michael, so I'm going to finish off the point. It's an utterly disingenuous argument. Most countries in Western Europe have a deficit.
All right.
An independent Scotland would have a small deficit. The UK has a deficit of 76 billion. Think about that.
Let's just hear from some in our audience as we move towards the end of our time. Well, gentlemen on the front row, and keep your hand up if you haven't spoken already.
Your entire campaign for the Scottish independence referendum was everything will stay the same, and that's why you wanted the EU as sort of an exit result. But if we are out of the EU, you've lost one of your status quo options, like keep Queen, keep the pound, keep the EU. You will now be asking Scottish people to leave the UK and hope to join the EU if we're out. This will not help you win, because I don't think if people are asked, do you want to join this thing called the EU, that they'll say yes.
But sir, you're assuming that Scotland would have to leave the European Union. Every citizen of Scotland has a continuing right to be a citizen of the European Union. The European Union has expanded greatly in recent years, with many small, newly independent nations joining it. It is simply ridiculous to think that an independent Scotland would not be welcome in the European Union. These are issues for another time.
Or the euro?
Well, we'd have to look at the situations pertaining at the time.
Right.
You can't expect me to make a decision about that here and now. We're just about to make a major decision on Thursday. We would need to look at the economic conditions at the time. We probably wouldn't want to be tied to the pound if it nosedives after a Brexit.
OK, Jim Sillars, very briefly, we're coming towards the end of our time.
In 2014, in a letter to the Scottish Parliament from the Vice President of the European Union, they told us, the day you're independent, you are out. In other words, get stuffed. They were on the side of better together. There is no reason to believe that they wouldn't tell us to get stuffed next time if the UK remains inside
but there is
the
reason to believe,
European
because
Union.
distinguished legal opinion says that Scotland would have a right to remain a member.
All right, we're going to have to leave it
It's
there
not
because
true.
we're out of time. All that remains is for me to say thank you very much indeed to the four on our panel and to our audience here. That's all we've got time for. Voting is on Thursday.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Well, thank you to Glenn Campbell there. We're watching that. Our political editor, Brian Taylor, has been with me. Brian, let's start at the end of that, because there was claim and counterclaim about what the EU referendum will mean for Scottish independence or not. You've got some clarity on that.
I hardly bring clarity because it's the entire thing is misted to the uncertainty of a referendum on Thursday. But I think what the Scottish Government might seek to do, I do not think that they would regard an independence referendum as absolutely a guaranteed prospect in the event that Britain leaves. But I think they would try and set the trail in motion. I think, for example, they might seek what's known as a Section 30 agreement, as was done prior to the referendum in 2014, to have that on the table in the event that they call a referendum, because Nicola Sturgeon would argue that circumstances have materially changed. And that is the way she would get round, I believe, Jim Sillar's point that the mandate in the manifesto is uncertain.
OK. Overall, of the 45 minutes, what's your analysis of the arguments for and against?
Struck by the way the economy and immigration come to the fore, but struck also by the way that neither side, and I don't blame them for this because this is the nature of politics and the absence of forecasting for the future, each side has to say, trust me with regard to the perspectives on the economy. Trust me with regard to perspectives on immigration. People have to make up their minds themselves as to which of those two perspectives they trust.
And very briefly, if you would, time and time again, it became party political as opposed to remain.
Yeah, again, struck by that. Kezia Dugdale, for example, saying don't blame the European Union, blame the Tories. Michael Forsyth trying to rebut that. Jim Sillar's also saying if Leave loses, he directly said that would be the responsibility, the blame, the fault of Nigel Farage for, as Mr Sillars believes, getting it wrong on the tone on immigration.
Thank you very much, Brian Taylor. To the weather now, and as it's the summer solstice, Kirsty MacDonald is on a beautiful Nairn beach for us this evening. Kirsty.
Yes, thank you very much, Jackie. Good evening to you from just east of Inverness. As you say, we're marking the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. This year falling on June the 20th because of it being a leap year, and indeed we're expecting around 17 hours of daylight across Scotland. Certainly here, as you can see on Nairn Beach, a lot of sunshine around. It's been really quite a pleasant day here. Certainly a marked improvement on the type of weather we have seen in much of the northeast of Scotland over the last few weeks, with a nagging northeasterly wind. Now, as far as this evening is concerned, across the country, a fine evening really, with some spells of brightness and sunshine. Any showers tending to fade away tonight. And we have clear spells for eastern areas. In the west, there will be a fair amount of cloud around, and we'll have some showry outbreaks of rain feeding into the northwest on a fairly keen south to southwesterly breeze. Not really a cold night, though. For most of us, temperatures will hold up around 10 to 12 Celsius. As we head into tomorrow, much of the east and the south, another fine day to come with some spells of brightness and sunshine developing. Always that bit more in the way of cloud across the west, and further outbreaks of rain in the northwest. So taking a closer look tomorrow afternoon, across much of the south and through central areas, it's looking fine and dry, brightness and sunshine. For much of the west coast, though, the northwest especially, some outbreaks of rain, perhaps something that bit drier across the Western Isles at times. For the Northern Isles, a peppering of showers, and a fine day to come across the northeast with some spells of brightness and sunshine and highs of 20 Celsius. Not much change really at all as we head into the evening, with the best of the sunshine in the east and the south. And as we head into Wednesday, again really quite a decent day of weather to come across Scotland. There will be a fair amount of brightness and sunshine around, perhaps just a scattering of showers at times. Temperatures widely into the mid to high teens, peaking around 20 Celsius. And for Thursday, again another quite decent day of weather to come, especially so in the east. So, Jackie, that is the forecast from here on Nairn Beach. As you can see, plenty of sunshine around. I might just go and build myself a sandcastle now. Back to you, Jackie.
You do that. Thank you very much, Kirsty. And now just time for a reminder of tonight's main news. Rail passengers across Scotland are facing the first in a series of strikes tomorrow. after talks at the Conciliation Service ACAS between the RMT Union and ScotRail broke down. We will, of course, have more of that in our morning bulletins tomorrow morning, but that's Reporting Scotland for now. I'm back with the headlines at 8 and the late bulletin at 10:30. Until then, from everyone in the team, have a very good evening.